When the reptilian species known as the Danshivas have decided to invade human territory, the humans didn't think much of them. The Danshivas are quite small compared to humans and quite weak, and their technology did not seem to compare either. But they had a trick up their sleeve. You see, the Danshivas had decided to wage war in a way that was off from everyone else. They would never want to land on a planet and risk their own people. They did not breed fast enough for this. They would not be able to deal with the attrition of all the losses. So instead, they would send down a carnivorous species from their planet, one that used to reign supreme over their world, but now was nothing more than an attraction. Their population was also kept in check due to their extreme danger in use. When the first time the humans saw this, they were petrified. They didn't know what they were seeing coming out of these large black capsules. The small metal doors opened up on the sides of these massive capsules. Turns out to be an organic feature. It turned out this was mostly food for these creatures. And when the humans saw this massive creature come out that looked somewhere between an insect, an arachnid, and something out of hell's asshole, they all freaked out. They were all scared at what was coming their way, and what they saw frightened them even more as these creatures took flight. These massive insects that seemed to be in the air dwarfed even the humans. How the Dashvas were even able to capture them, the humans didn't know, nor did they care. They simply were sent a message to leave this planet, and they would be forced out if necessary, and the humans, of course, wouldn't listen. Unfortunately for those humans on the surface, they were not ready for something like this. Even their massive tanks, which they had very few of, were only able to hold for a short amount of time before these insects decided to tear apart the tanks themselves. This was scary enough, but also any human in an exosuit was only able to fight for a little while, as these insectoid carapaces were incredibly hard. However, they were still susceptible to fire and to high explosive. They did not heal very quickly. In fact, it didn't look like they could regenerate much at all, and many of these insects seemed to bleed out if you severed enough of their body parts, but that would still take hours. Some of them would even lose their head and run around still thrashing and kicking and flying into everything, destroying all the infrastructure and killing anyone they come across. When the human ambassador tried to contact their enemy and asked them why they had released such a horrible creature, they received a message that basically translated into, "You should have left." Humanity was not going to take this lying down, as the Danshavas did this to over a dozen other colony worlds on the edge of human territory. The humans began to call up with a single message: call pest control. The Danshavas didn't understand this. How could they control something that wasn't a pest? It was a threat. In fact, they knew exactly how to bring these animals to heel the moment they touched down. They wouldn't have any problems taking over the planet once all the humans were taken care of, and then their giant insects were simply called to heel, to sit, beg, and roll over like any other pet. They believed that is what they were saying. Instead of pest, they thought it was pet control. They didn't know how the humans could possibly control such creatures. But control was not what humanity had in mind. Instead, humanity dropped large cylinders and landed very large ships onto the planets themselves. As they did, they started leaching out some sort of strange aerosol. It was odd. It was a fog that seemed to reach out across the planet, so much so that everywhere from 3 meters and up was covered in this strange fog. The Danshavas watched this through the monitors and didn't know what was going on. Were they simply trying to blind them? Were they simply trying to stop their babies from going in and taking over these colonies? In fact, the same insects were going to be used on the next colony world and the next colony worlds until they got to the core worlds, where they would condense their numbers and send them down to slaughter all of humanity, force them to heal under their rule. But that dream would be short-lived, as they saw one of the human battleships come into the atmosphere. It was just barely on the edge as it fired something else into the fog. The Danshavas were surprised. They didn't know what was going on, and a strange blue fog seemed to mix in with all the rest and spread across the planet with extreme fury. They were utterly shocked at what they saw next. Their insect creatures, the ones they had sent down to be their army, started thrashing and jumping as though they were trying to get out of the fog. Those that could still take flight did, but it seemed as though they were lethargic, swaying this way and that way, eventually trying to find any place to land. They couldn't find any place to land that wasn't covered by this strange foam, even just a little bit, and it seemed to almost burn them as they landed next to it, as it would just touch the very tip of their wings or the very tip of their toes. It was enough to make them scream and take flight again, and eventually they would run themselves out of energy and fall helplessly into the fog itself, and again would thrash. And the Danshavas realized what was going on. They had turned the entire planet into a giant insecticide tent. But they realized that their babies would not go down so easy, as many of them started burrowing deep, deep into the ground. They didn't realize that the fog itself was heavy. It was going to start sinking into every single crevice there was. There were a few that were able to just barely reach above and find a place to nest outside of where the fog was. And it seemed as though they waited, patiently waited for some sort of rescue, as though they waited for their master to come home from work. They seemed to look up at the sky, but what happened next was enough to make the Danshavas truly shake. That same battleship, this time well outside of the atmosphere, fired 24 different pieces of ordnance into the planet, spreading them all the way out, and they all landed with a thud. They couldn't see on the monitors what had happened, and simultaneously they all went off. Suddenly, all the fog caught fire. It burned across the planet with unholy vengeance, scorching everything that was there. And as it did so, it took every last drop of oxygen out of the atmosphere, and anything that was alive was no longer alive. Anything that was buried deep was shot out like a cannon or simply exploded from the heat. Anything that was still barely breathing inside the fire had its air sucked out of whatever version of lungs it might have. And those that were outside of there tried to take flight and then realized that they were burning all their oxygen up. What little bit they had inside of them was expelled, and when they tried to draw more breath in, they realized there was no breath to breathe. And down they went, choking and kicking. And within just a few minutes, all the fog had completely dissipated, and the only thing left on the surface was the flicking, dead, scorched corpses of their entire invasion force. On every single colony that they had invaded, the same thing played out within 24 hours of each other. They had no time to go in and draw their insects back. And they wondered, how in the flying hells did the humans come up with something like this? When they asked the humans after the peace treaty was signed, how they came up with the idea to even take out a large insectoid race like that, the humans simply smiled and laughed, a sound that the Danshavas found very irritating, and still demanded an answer. Finally, one of the young officers simply walked up and said, "Don't you know the only good bug is a dead bug?" The Donchevaz looked surprised at this, knowing that there were insects, beneficial ones, on the human's home planet, and then asked, "But how how did you know to go in and to destroy every single one? Why would you do that? Why didn't you just take out half of them and force us to retrieve the rest and retreat back?" Well, that's by our philosophy of dealing with large bugs like that. This time, it was their sergeant major talking. The Don Chavas commander said, "Oh, you already had a policy for giant bugs? What would that be?" Without skipping a beat, the sergeant major raised his chest and said, "Kill 'em all!"